I'm delighted to introduce next Representative Lori Trahan, who proudly serves Massachusetts' 3rd District in the House of Representatives. Growing up in a working-class family in Lowell, Massachusetts, Lori learned the principles of sacrifice, hard work, and grit. She was the first in her family to graduate college. She earned a scholarship to play Division I volleyball at Georgetown. After college, she joined former Congressman Marty Meehan's staff, working her way up to Chief of Staff. After serving Massachusetts for nearly 10 years, Lori moved to the private sector as the only female executive at a tech company, and later a co-founder of a women-owned and operated consulting firm focused on elevating women to leadership positions. Lori successfully ran for Congress in 2018, motivated to return to public service after seeing the Trump administration's gridlock and lack of accountability. Her words, not mine. Sworn in alongside a historically diverse class of new members, Lori immediately got to work for the people of the 3rd District. And now, as a member of the powerful House Committee on Energy and Commerce, Lori is an advocate for 3rd District residents, working to expand access to affordable quality healthcare, tackle climate change, protect kids online, fight disinformation, and more. When the coronavirus pandemic hit in March of 2020, Lori rolled up her sleeves and got to work. She secured hundreds of millions of dollars in federal relief funding to keep workers and businesses afloat, ensure hospitals and health centers remained open, and shorten the Commonwealth's road to recovery. As vaccines were being distributed, Lori worked around the clock to make sure individual communities had the resources and support necessary to get shots into arms and save lives. As families across the 3rd District recover, Lori is working to ensure that no one is left behind. And we're delighted to have her as our next speaker.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me here with you today. It is truly a pleasure. And before I talk about my background and how it has informed my work in Congress, including the legislation that I've introduced and we'll talk about today, I'd first like to just reflect on the state of democracy around the globe. You know, for most of my life, people have talked about American exceptionalism, the notion that the bad things and the crises that happened in other countries could never happen here. A coup, an anti-democratic uprising, never in the United States. But on January 6, 2021, it all changed. America was no longer the exception. It was just the latest example of a democracy teetering on the brink of authoritarianism. Personally, I was at the Capitol that day, ready to do my job and certify the presidential election. And I was looking forward to working with a president who denounces hate, who discouraged violence, abhorred discrimination. Little did I know what was going to unfold in the next 12 hours. The day after the insurrection, I boarded a plane home to be with my family, my 2 young daughters, who we desperately tried to shield the news of the violent attack that day. I was carrying a copy of the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, both front pages covering in excruciating detail the attack by thousands of Trump supporters who beat and overran police, infiltrated the United States Capitol in an attempt to overturn our presidential election. Still processing the emotions myself, I was dumbfounded by the dozens of rally-goers who were around me, thanks to what they were reading on their social media pages, were adamant that the attack was a false flag operation carried out by Antifa. They didn't care about the evidence, the footage of the attack, the photos of bloodied officers, the ransacked Senate chamber, and the blood on the walls outside the House chamber. They saw a different reality, and their echo chamber convinced them that it was fact, that it was final. Now, if each of us in this room know, the weaponization of disinformation and hateful, dehumanizing speech is a threat to human rights and to democracies around the world. This morning you heard from Maria Ressa, who has had a front row seat to the role social media has played in sowing discord and strengthening authoritarian leaders in the Philippines. And as we speak, social media accounts linked to the Chinese government and troll farms are spreading Vladimir Putin's propaganda about Ukraine. Meanwhile, disinformation, conspiracy theory, and blatantly miscaptioned videos tied to US politics are spreading like wildfire throughout Latin America and through Spanish-speaking communities here at home. The point of all of that is very simple. Access to quality information and the health of a democracy, including election outcomes and human rights, are inextricably linked. They always have been. But throughout my life and career, I have witnessed the rise of the ad-driven online social media ecosystem and the grave dangers it poses without a serious course correction. So I was the first in my family to graduate from college, as you heard. I earned a scholarship to play Division I volleyball right here in DC at Georgetown University. I studied at the School of Foreign Service, eyeing a life of public service in America's diplomatic corps. Now, as you can see, with me standing before you today, life had different plans. My dad was diagnosed with MS while I was in school, and I moved home shortly after graduation to stay close. That's when I joined the staff of Congressman Marty Meehan as a scheduler, and eventually worked up to become a chief of staff. And in that role, I helped craft comprehensive campaign finance reform. You may have heard of it, McCain-Feingold, Shays-Meehan, because dark money was corrupting our democracy. It was creating more polarization and taking power away from voters, something that's sadly still happening to this day and at levels we never could have imagined before the Supreme Court's Citizens United ruling. Getting this legislation signed into law was an enormous lift, but watching it be signed into law filled me with the resolve to stand up for democratic values wherever I was. So after a decade in Congress, I departed for the private sector, taking a position as the only female executive at a tech startup in Cambridge. And it was there that I first really engaged in the ad tech space, seeing in real time the shift away from the early days of the internet and the embrace of profitability that would very quickly come to rule the day in the years after I left in the mid-2000s. That's when I switched career paths to something that still guides me today, co-founding a woman-owned and operated consulting firm. We advised companies on business strategy and how to create the conditions for employees, especially women, to thrive. A large part of that work was ensuring that women weren't just present in the boardroom, but actually had a seat and, more importantly, a voice at the table. That's why when my congresswoman from the district I grew up in, raised my family in, and later served as a staffer, announced that she was retiring in 2017, I was in. It's not just that I wanted to bring my experience working in tech to a legislative body that, frankly, has been trying to keep up with Silicon Valley, but I also wanted to fight for a better future for my two daughters, Grace and Caroline, who had watched the election of a president who promised to undo the progress we've made in the hopes of restoring the same American exceptionalism he'd later undermine for good. So I started by discussing social media's impact on democracy because even with the previous president now out of the White House, his influence and his ideology is one of the most engaging on large platforms. And of course, that makes them profitable. But that's dangerous because of the continued threat to our democracy and to human rights. I mean, the people who infiltrated the Capitol, they're running for office, and they have a good chance of winning. As many of you know, women across the United States are staring down the barrel of having our reproductive rights rolled back as the Supreme Court, a court put in place by minority rule in the Senate, mind you, looks to overturn 50 years of precedent on abortion access. And we have been stalled in preempting those rights by codifying them because the Senate is hampered by the filibuster, an outdated parliamentary rule that has historically been used to block progress just like this. To make matters worse, frightening honestly, is that in some states with draconian anti-abortion laws ready to take effect, women could very quickly learn what migrant groups and vulnerable populations have known for a long time. That data collected by these platforms isn't just used to target ads, but could also be used very quickly to identify, investigate, and potentially even prosecute women who have visited an abortion clinic. This means women already facing one of the most important decisions of their lives also have to be concerned about their healthcare data getting into the hands of individuals who want to criminalize their choices they make about their own bodies. But this is, of course, just the most recent implication of the United States' failure to enact comprehensive regulations for the technology sector. And that has to change for women, for our rights, and for the future of our democracy. So, with the state of democracy and many of the basic human rights we've come to cherish at risk, where do we go from here? It's a question that many of my colleagues in Congress are realizing that we need to answer. And we're fortunate to have models for action charted by many of you here today. Laws and regulations like the GDPR, the Digital Services Act, the Digital Markets Act are long overdue, and I commend everyone who has fought so hard to advance them across the Atlantic. But we can't overlook the fact that many of the biggest contributors to the current broken system, Facebook, Twitter, Amazon, Google, are American companies. And it's incumbent on America to get off the sidelines and take responsibility for the deeply flawed incentive structures that have helped them grow to what they are today. After all, these companies were designed to grow at all costs. And at a fundamental level, it's in their best interest to amplify the most engaging content. And that's what's happening. The Facebook papers highlight how employees within these companies have come forward with ideas and proposals to redesign recommender systems and content labels to decrease the spread of harmful content. But time after time, executives at the highest levels have shelved these projects in favor of maintaining maximum profitability. The consequences of that are not new. In fact, over the course of American history, the federal government has created and employed key organizations explicitly designed to keep pace with rapidly developing industry, things like cars, airplanes, and banks. These agencies help inform regulations and guidance designed to protect consumers. The Great Depression forced Congress to create the Securities and Exchange Commission and tasked it with oversight and regulation of the financial industry to protect investors. And almost 80 years later, Congress passed the Dodd-Frank Act in response to the 2008 financial crisis, strengthening consumer protections against financial market abuse, implementing updated transparency and accountability requirements for the entire system. Today, we find ourselves at a similar inflection point, faced with a largely unregulated tech industry that's harming users over and over again in favor of growth at all costs. Our response must be strong, and it must be multifaceted. We have to reform antitrust laws so they make sense for digital markets that have next to no real competition. We have to implement a comprehensive privacy law that provides consumers with key data rights. We need to make narrow reforms to Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. And we need comprehensive transparency requirements, which has been a focus of mine over the past 18 months and are essential to supporting each of the proposals I just listed. So most recently, I wrote the Digital Services Oversight and Safety Act. We'll call that DSOSA for short. To fulfill the need for comprehensive transparency legislation and to hold companies accountable for the promises they make to consumers, advertisers, and parents. Now, DSOSA takes inspiration from the transparency and oversight reforms in the financial sector to add much-needed protections for consumers online. And it does so by establishing a new Bureau of Digital Services Oversight and Safety within the Federal Trade Commission. Specifically, the Bureau is tasked with investigating systemic risks, things like the dissemination of illegal content, discrimination, and amplification of false or harmful content. And the Bureau will also issue transparency and disclosure requirements, risk assessments, mitigation reports, for example, as well as guidance on content-neutral safety processes and design features. The new Bureau would be made up of at least 500 employees with expertise necessary to understand the systemic risks posed by platforms, conduct investigations, provide guidance to companies, and better inform agencies, lawmakers, and the public. For those of you who may be less familiar with the U.S. regulatory environment, this would be huge. The FTC currently only has 1,100 employees tasked with consumer protection and antitrust enforcement for nearly every sector of the economy, and most employees are experts in law or economics. DeSosa would change that by allowing the agency to hire a variety of experts, including technologists, child development specialists, statisticians, and others who are capable of assessing a wide array of systemic risks online. One thing I'm particularly excited about with this bill is the creation of an Office of Independent Research Facilitation within the Bureau, something that has been a top priority of mine since I first introduced the Social Media Data Act last year. Unlike some other approaches out there, this legislation would set up a system through which certified researchers affiliated with an organization recognized by the Bureau can study the impacts of algorithms, their impacts of platforms, their content moderation practices, their product design and algorithms, and of course, the fallout from those decisions, both the harmful content that is amplified and the content that is wrongfully removed. Within this portion of DeSosa, we took a page out of Social Media Data Act's playbook by requiring that large covered platforms host two separate ad libraries, one public and one just for researchers, who can look into discriminatory ad targeting. It also requires that these same platforms provide researchers with the access necessary to understand the ways and which types of content are being amplified. Now, you're probably wondering who's covered. Who are these large covered platforms? Well, when Congress passed Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act in 1996, it designated interactive computer services as different from traditional media like newspapers and TV outlets. The idea was that these services, which we now refer to as platforms, are not traditional publishers, but are instead hosts of user-generated content, meaning they shouldn't be held liable for most things users say on platforms and are allowed to moderate that content. Of course, that distinction between interactive computer services and traditional publishers has led to the internet as we know it today, the good and the bad. The thing is, if interactive computer services get a special distinction and the power to moderate content, they need oversight. And when we stand up oversight bodies, we need to take into consideration the fact that the term ICS has come to include a wide range of companies, from Wikipedia to local online job boards. The new Bureau, even with hundreds of employees, can't thoroughly cover the full scope of online platforms. I don't think most of us believe any one organization can. That's why the goal with DeSosa is focused on those that pose the greatest risk, something that, of course, the Bureau can change based on the scale and scope of the platform. So video sharing platforms may have different requirements than job boards, which may have different requirements than web hosting platforms, just as an example. Those details would be sorted out through rulemaking, which allows for open comment periods where a range of stakeholders can weigh in. So how does DeSosa compare with Europe's recently agreed upon Digital Services Act? DeSosa is similar to the Digital Services Act that it uses tiered requirements where large covered platforms have more obligation. The definitions of covered platforms are also similar, with a focus on platforms that disseminate user-generated content to the public. The bill also have similar transparency and reporting requirements, independent audits, voluntary guidance, and researcher access. The major difference is in enforcement. In the US, Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act determines what content and conduct platforms are liable for. DeSosa does not amend Section 230. The enforcement is simple. Platforms must follow the rules and not be materially misleading in their reports. So why focus on key transparency requirements? I mean, what does transparency really solve? Well, there are limits to what transparency can solve. No question about that. I mean, it's why I've been so supportive of my colleagues who are working on comprehensive privacy and antitrust reform. But transparency into the opaque processes and algorithms employed by these platforms does two things other tech policy can't. One, it provides the information we need as a country to craft evidence-based recommendations for risk mitigation. Questions like, what is the best process for platforms to fact-check content? Or how can recommendation algorithms encourage healthy discourse as opposed to polarization? Or in what ways does social media impact teen mental health? These are questions scholars are still working to understand today, and frankly, could have benefited from more data years ago. And two, there are some challenges that will simply be best solved with sunlight. US government is never going to tell platforms they have to remove misleading content point blank. It's protected speech. But false content can be mitigated by more accurate content. As an aside, I'll just note that one challenge with these platforms is that my newsfeed, my Google search results are different from yours and are different from our neighbors. This makes it really hard for me to correct or even offer a different point of view. Transparency can help us understand what others see and experience online. As mentioned before, transparency can also complement other legislative initiatives. For example, a comprehensive privacy law will put guardrails on the way an individual's data can be used by internet services, but other online harms, namely related to dissemination of harmful content and manipulation of platforms, will still remain. Harmful content will still be online. It is true that a good privacy law will limit the way that content is targeted to individuals, but there are other ways platforms can amplify content based on total likes or number of shares, data totally divorced from individual users. For example, consider a ban on surveillance advertising, something a strong privacy law could do. Contextual advertising would still pose risks. A pill party ad could be placed on a web page about a hot new band teens follow, and that would essentially be an ad targeted to teens through context. Ad libraries will remain critical for understanding potentially discriminatory ad targeting practices. Additionally, the whole concept behind antitrust reform is that by ensuring robust competition, we give consumers and advertisers choice. Right now, most advertisers are forced to use Facebook and Google, even if they disagree with those companies' values. Once competition is restored, the reports issued by the Bureau will be vital for helping consumers, parents, and advertisers choose where to spend their time and their money. Similarly, if Congress passes a law that mandates interoperability and portability, users would be able to move their data to another platform that aligns with their values. The community standards, transparency reports, and public repository of large covered platforms provide consumers the information they need to make those choices. Lastly, we know that any changes to Section 230 will impact content moderation processes and platform design. The reporting requirements in DSOSA, specifically the researcher access, will allow for proper evaluation of those policy changes and will provide insights into if groups have their rights to freedom of expression compromised. So the name of today's conference is the Global Summit to Address Online Harm and Misinformation. So naturally, I focused on my concerns regarding the state of our internet, but I also want to acknowledge the promise of these platforms. For example, at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, I knew I needed to get information to my constituents quickly and safely. Without being able to attend in-person events, I turned to Facebook, hosting virtual town halls. Currently, celebrities are using social media to raise funds for important causes, from delivering humanitarian aid to Ukrainians to abortion access funds. And frequently, people with rare illnesses are able to find and connect with global communities to enhance their understanding and advocacy capacity. These technologies have the power to be a tool for furthering human rights, but we have to put policies in place to correct against the incentives that lead to hate and disinformation. As a mother and a lawmaker, I worry not just about the democratic structures and culture we're leaving to our next generation, but also their development and their well-being. I have 2 young girls coming into their tween years and 3 children in early adulthood. I see the impact today's technologies have on their lives, from beauty filters on their apps to immediate ad targeting based on household purchases of media consumption habits. While I wouldn't consider our household big on this, my team and I have also looked into the online gaming industry and its impact on children, a topic of increasing importance as alternative reality and virtual reality platforms allow users to enter online space as a 3D avatar with hazmat suits that will make the line between physical and online worlds even more blurry. Some suggest that we don't yet know the impact AR/VR will have, but as discussed here today, we do know the risks to human well-being, harassment and hate speech, power over what ads people see, when in their subsequent purchasing decisions, disinformation strategically and opaquely spreading to sway elections and reduce human autonomy. We should not wait for these risks to emerge and calcify. We need policies today that change the incentives and demand that platforms are designed with human safety in mind. I want to leave you with some thoughts on the need for international collaboration. I do believe there is a bipartisan path forward in the United States to pass comprehensive privacy laws, antitrust reform, and transparency, but it's likely going to be a bumpy one. And my colleagues, myself, and many of you have to settle for sometimes frustrating reality that important change often has to come incrementally. As with most big problems, the challenge of online harms will be addressed through a variety of stakeholders working together over time. As the Digital Services Act goes into effect, Europe will begin to write the standards for ad libraries, risk assessments and audits, public transparency reporting, and researcher access protocols, things I've been advocating for throughout the Congress. My hope is that these platforms will extend these protections and disclosures to consumers around the world, something I intend to be persistent about. Meanwhile, the U.S. Federal Trade Commission now has a full set of commissioners and can enforce existing antitrust laws, allowing for new online businesses to emerge that optimize for a diverse set of values. The FTC will also be able to use their Unfair and Deceptive Acts authority to keep consumers safe. That's absolutely critical in this moment, and I'll continue to advocate for resources at this important agency. But even beyond the FTC, we still have a long way to go to rein in the unchecked power of large digital platforms. And here in the United States, we're looking abroad for examples. And it's my hope that sooner rather than later, you'll be able to look at us as a partner that you need. So I want to thank you all again. The stakes can feel daunting, but the opportunities we have ahead to work together, to collaborate on solutions, will be the way that we find the best path forward. Thanks again. I only have 3 minutes left, so I'm happy to take a question. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Julie Grant. I'm Australia's e-safety commissioner.
Oh, great to meet you.
Which is basically what you've envisioned with your association. We've been regulating big tech for a range of online harms for the past 7 years.
Thank you.
And well, thank you. Your vision, we could have written your speech. And so I guess the first thing I would say is do look beyond the Atlantic to what's happening in the Pacific,
Yeah.
not just in Australia, but in New Zealand. And we've got David Shanks here.
Great.
We just, in fact, issued 8 notices in terms of 2 core sites that are hosted here in the United States that are hosting the Buffalo Bridge. And we also have safety by design initiative that we've done with 80 members of the industry. So I guess my question here is, gosh, we want you to be successful, but we've also watched privacy legislation languish for probably 15 years.
Yeah.
What is it going to take for Congress to act, and what can we do as part of the international community to show that you can regulate for online harms and serious abuse without quashing innovation and freedom of speech?
That's right.
And can safety by design become a standard so that companies are using this as a forethought rather than an afterthought?
No, great question, and thank you for your work. I mean, truly, I did not mean to leave out the Pacific, because there are a lot of great models I think that we as legislators have to follow, and those are outside the borders of our country. What it will take, I have been most frustrated by the fact that we've had watershed moment after watershed moment. The Facebook papers, Frances Haugen's testimony this past summer, you can't avert your eyes. And there are, hearings where there's maybe 5 or 6 hours of discomfort for these big tech CEOs, but then they go on. In fact, I get regular newsletters, and there are ads typically taken out. We want Congress to act. We want Congress to take this off of us while they're spending millions of dollars to prevent us from taking action. And so the hypocrisy, I know well. I do think that there's probably our best shot in comprehensive privacy reform for a number of different reasons that I won't get into, but the stars are feeling like they're aligning for us to take up privacy in the fall. I think that both sides of the aisle understand there is going to be some differences that we have to overcome. But the diagnosis is so clear, and it's just been so long overdue. In terms of what you're already doing is providing us with a roadmap. I mean, so much of this policy making, when you don't have the data, when you don't have the researcher access and the data and the ideas that are generated from that, you really are having a taste great, less filling argument. So we have to dispense with that. And I think one of the things that you will just naturally do is show the way, right? You're going to show that the sky has not fallen. You're going to show that our kids can be healthier online. You're going to show that we can have transparency without infringement on privacy. And I think those are important models for the United States to look at. And then look, it just takes leadership here. I think one of the reasons why I like to be in a room like this one is because we're pretty much like-minded in terms of change needs to happen now. And we need to have more people in those rooms so that they feel like, one, it's possible. I mean, you got to get over the hurdle of I might not know the ins and outs of the algorithms and the ad targeting and how that all works, but they understand that it's bad. It's bad for their children. It's bad for society, for democracy. No one benefits when disinformation is this widely distributed. So I do think that we are at that moment right now, and electing leaders certainly is always the part that are not scared to venture into this space and to make, tough decisions on all those fronts. Antitrust, Section 230, transparency and privacy will be key. So thank you for what you're doing. I really appreciate it. Know that you're serving as a roadmap for all of us and wringing out the lessons that you've gone through, and just making sure we're on a path to continuous improvement is something that I 100% commit to. So thanks again.